This is Chapter 2 of the International Relations class. For this lecture, we'll be looking at the realist perspective of the international system, and this contrasts primarily with the institutionalist view of the international system, which we will be looking at in the next chapter. So realism deals with looking at the world in terms of power, primarily. The power of sovereign states. The state is the primary actor in the realist view. The state is pursuing their own national interest for the most part. So therefore, peace is gained primarily through the strength that states may have in order to maintain order or to deter any type of conflict. So we'll get into some of those terms. And stability occurs through this balance of power. And this balance of power could literally be one superpower balancing with everyone else. Or it could be a couple, two or three major powers that are balancing off of each other. So realism looks at the world in an anarchic state, and now this does not mean chaos. This is the lack of a central global government to enforce rules. So therefore, states have sovereignty, where they are responsible for their own decision making and can do whatever they want within their own territory, obviously to a point, because one of the things that we've already touched on with the international system is that the other states come together and establish global norms that would keep states in check, or at least pursuing goals that are in the global interests. But for the realist perspective, sovereignty is the reigning norm, that states are pursuing their own self-interests, and they can have the power to do what they feel like is in their best interests. So that means we're talking about power quite a bit, the capability to get other actors to do what otherwise they might not do. This comes in various types of power: coercion through force, or just making of threats, or inducements, enticements that would allow states to influence what other states are doing. The term authority is a function of this power, and this authority can come through the recognition that you've been given that authority, some sort of social approval that could be from long-reigning traditions and norms, and then some form of legitimacy has been conferred upon that authority. Even if it's a dictator or a family rule, then yes, that has been legitimized by centuries of norms and traditions. Power is predominant through this realist view over, in general, morality, ideology, socioeconomic aspects. Now, of course, that's a little bit to the extreme side there, but that's what we would call Machiavellian, which was influenced by the work by Machiavelli, The Prince, which was the kind of the defining or the foundational work that the realist influence is based on, that power is predominant over all other things. Now, relative power means the rising and falling power ratio between states, and this could be a potential source of conflict that we'll look at later on. As far as measuring power, GDP is typically, which is gross domestic product, is typically used to measure the size of your economy through your consumption, your productive capacity. Obviously, if you have a large GDP, you're going to have more potential for larger economy that is a larger consumer base, more productive capacity, more wealth that people can use for various things, more technology, even more military perhaps. So GDP remains the central unit to measure at least economic power, and then a lot can evolve out of that large economic power. There's non-material elements as well, such as a national will, and this may be a function of how cohesive your society is or homogeneous your society may be, or how much they are supportive of the norms of your society. Diplomacy, obviously, the ability to go out and communicate and deal with other countries, the popular support that your government has, the ability to mobilize different ideologies or religions to support your view of power. In America, we have a diverse array of interests, whether it's ideologies and religions. That makes it a little bit more difficult to get a cohesive political will, you could say. But we also are united by this concept of the American dream. We'll talk about that a little bit, which is diluted somewhat, or at least just the general norms of the democratic society that the United States has evolved in. Military strength, another form of measuring power that we'll talk about more later. Soft power is a concept that came up primarily in the aftermath of the Iraq War when it was not going well. The United States had really kind of taken the lead in that military intervention, and because of the mixed results that we got from that, there was other alternatives that maybe we can lead through influence rather through military force, or by persuading others to follow our lead through an attractive example, like setting the tone for the rest of the world to follow. So that's the concept of soft power, which we've somewhat retracted from a lot of this, particularly with the current administration, where Trump actually ran on the platform to try to retract from our international influence and look more of a nationalist mindset. As far as the long-term elements of power, in addition to GDP, we've got population. The more people you have, the more resources you potentially have. And one of the key criteria for a successful economy in particular is this dependency ratio, which is the number of working people divided by the number of non-working people. And we see that with every developed country in the world, that dependency ratio is shrinking because our populations are getting older, and so therefore we are having fewer people working, supporting more people that are not working, particularly retired people, and children, of course, are included in this group down here as well. The dependency ratio for the United States is shrinking as well. Have to look at ways to beef up that ratio over time. Other factors that are, you might could say, kind of luck of the draw within your territory, as far as your access to ports, or how your territory might be protecting you in certain cases, the geography, the natural resources that you're blessed with within your territory. So those are obviously elements of power. Looking at population growth, even though this is from 2015, it's already showing how the rich countries of the world are declining in population. So as you can see, the United States and Canada and most of Europe and even Australia are already in this very small 0 to 1% population growth. However, just last year, the United States had a replacement rate of 1.7. Now, we'll talk about this more detail later, but the rate to sustain your growth is 2.1 children per couple. That makes sense. You have to have at least 2 children to sustain your population. And the United States is already at 1.7, so I would argue that we are already in this negative territory right here, like much of Europe is. Russia, quite dramatically, and Japan even more dramatically still, that they are to the point where they are looking for ways to try to increase their population growth rate. Now, ironically, the poorest countries of the world are the ones that have the highest population growth, the countries that have less ability to sustain or support that increased population growth. And there's reasons for that, and we'll talk about that in the chapter on economics and biosphere and population growth rates and things like that, that as your country becomes more economically developed, there's less incentive to have more children. So that's what we're seeing here quite obviously in the richest countries of the world in particular. Here's a map that's also showing the trend that the rich countries have been embarking on for several decades, and that's where the rich countries of the world have been deindustrializing to where the multinational corporations are looking for opportunities to produce their products for cheaper labor in other countries. And then our societies are going more into the service industry or the information technology. So you can see pretty much across the board, the richest countries of the world are already into this realm here where we're more than 50% in services as far as what kind of products that we produce here. And on the other side of that, the flip side of that, the poorest countries of the world are the ones that are still relying quite a bit on agricultural products and maintaining low income. They have not globalized their agriculture, so a lot of this is subsistence farming. So that's the trend we're seeing there in the poorest countries of the world, still relying on what we call primary products that are, for the most part, providing raw materials for the rich countries to either consume or to process into consumer products and commodities. So we'll hit on this topic more as we go as well. Now, since oil is a very important commodity for our energy, and we've been trying to find alternatives to oil with wind and solar and other renewable energy sources, but oil is still a very important product that drives almost entirely our transportation sector. And the United States, just in the last few years, has actually gone to the top of the biggest oil producer in the world, and we also consume by quite a large percent. We have 5% of the world's population, but we consume 20% of the world's total. So we still have to import some. Now we'll look at China here in a minute in a little bit more detail, because China is a very large consumer of oil, but a relatively small producer of oil, which they need for their huge population and their economic development, where they would like to get all of their people into a higher standard of living. So the top providers of crude oil to China, and this also brings up some interesting realist viewpoints of self-interests of countries, to where if I rely on providing you oil, then that could have geopolitical ramifications to it. For example, when the United States was placing sanctions, this was before the Trump administration, we were placing sanctions on Iran in order to get them to the table to deal on their nuclear program, to get them to cut out their nuclear arms program. And originally, Russia and China did not want to agree with those sanctions for geopolitical reasons. China, quite obviously, because they get a significant chunk of oil from Iran. Obviously, that's not the only reason, but it's part of it. Russia may have other interests as well, as far as relating to or allying with Iran in some way. They're both authoritarian systems, and that matters, because if democratic states are sanctioning authoritarian states, then other authoritarian states, such as China and Russia, may go on, oh, wait a minute, they might start doing the same thing to us to pressure us to become more democratic. So there's lots of other complicated issues into this mix here, but this is just some examples of states pursuing their interests. Now, as far as short-term elements of power, military power is typically viewed as the most important element of short-term power, and that, of course, would include the the size of your military, how prepared you are. The United States, as we'll see, has the biggest military in the world by far, which is kind of what also leads to that unipolar hegemonic stability theory. The quality of the bureaucracy that supports the military, the support of the people, and the legitimacy that the military is provided by the people. Even though America has engaged in military conquests that did not turn out very well at all. I mean, Vietnam, a prime example. Even the war in Iraq did not turn out as expected, with clearly mixed results. But we still have a very strong respect and support for our military personnel. And then the loyalty of the military themselves to our government, that's also a very strong norm, that the military is part of that executive branch that follows the commander-in-chief. So that's looking at military power. Now, as far as this balance of power aspect, where we have a handful of superpowers in the world, these 7 states right here account for more than half of the world's GDP and 2/3 of the world's military spending. And then the textbook has got this figure right here that shows, as far as percent of military expenditures worldwide, United States much larger than everyone else. China has the world's largest population with rapid economic growth, and they are becoming pretty much on par with the United States as far as economics go. As far as total GDP, they're still fairly low in GDP per capita because of their huge population, still bringing a lot of people out of poverty in the rural areas. But China is also building their military force as well. This is another chart showing the top military spenders. Now, this is 2018 chart, and we see that under the Trump administration, this number has actually gone up to $700 billion. So that's somewhat ironic that the Trump campaign ran on disengaging from military conquests around the world, but yet once in office actually increases the military, more for nationalist-leaning sentiments there. China is by far ahead of everyone else for the second most military expense, and they are growing probably at a faster rate than the United States is. And, that brings up questions of perhaps a new Cold War between USA and China, not in the way that it was with the Soviet Union. U.S. and China are very much intertwined and interdependent on each other for their economies. It is considerably less likely that there would be conflict between the two states, despite the rhetoric and, of course, the trade wars and things like that. But when you're that interdependent on each other for your economies, that makes a conflict less likely. But there probably will be considerable competition for global leadership. China clearly looks as though they want to be the superpower that influences everyone else. Looking at this power distribution again, we talked about the multipolar system, which was most evident between the world wars when we had several states, some falling, some rising, and then the bipolar system, which was the Cold War period between the United States and the Soviet Union, primarily because of the arms race. And then once the Soviet Union collapsed and communism pretty much fell, then the unipolar system took place, to where the United States was considered the sole superpower. And we have kind of retracted from that concept, particularly in the aftermath of the Iraq wars and the Afghanistan wars, where we were the leaders in the war on terror. And then those wars did not really turn out as expected, weren't as decisive as we were expecting. Terrorism increased dramatically once those wars started and started getting a little bit more unstable and chaotic. So this power transition theory, which I mentioned earlier, the largest wars resulted from rising powers suppressing the most powerful. For example, post-World War I, the rise of Germany and Japan coincided with the fall of the British Empire as well as the fall of some of the power of France there. And as I said, US and China faced a similar dynamic, however, remained very interdependent on their economies. Not quite the same situation here. Now, this hegemonic stability theory, particularly that defines this unipolar concept, the superpower provides some order, either through a large military where they can exert a lot of presence, or they can provide a lot of influence, or even perhaps a lot of coercion, depending on what the interests are. And as I said, the United States led the war on terror. Obviously, we were the victims of the 9/11 attacks, so we were highly motivated to do that, but we also tried to organize a global effort that everyone would follow us. And in fact, the words were either you're with us or against us. But particularly since the Trump administration, where we're kind of retracting from our international engagement, this concept is changing as we speak. Now, from the realist view, an alliance is something that states would pursue to accomplish their individual goals, not necessarily a global goal. So that's a coalition of states that coordinates actions to accomplish a specific goal for those states. And these are typically fluid. There have been some alliances that have been around for a long time, but typically by definition, this is a marriage of convenience to where you could form against a common enemy at that time, but you could be allying with a former enemy or perhaps even a future enemy in these alliances. And another thing with the alliance, as with this unipolar theory there, the larger states are going to be bearing the bulk of the costs because they can and because it's probably they're the ones with the primary interests for driving this alliance anyway. And with alliances, you have the risk of being pulled into conflict over regional issues because of this alliance agreement. World War I is perhaps an example of that, and we even see with World War II, the Allied forces came together against the Axis forces that were creating the havoc with the imperial takeovers. So that is probably the biggest potential for a major war, is when superpowers start to line up on opposite sides into alliances. So that certainly, we can't rule that out. That could still happen today. It's just that we are different environment today, different situation, more complex global economy plays into that as well. NATO is an example of an alliance that, even though it's been around for a while, its mission has shifted to suit the players. So that's another example of a realist view of what an alliance is for. NATO formed in 1949 originally to provide a zone of protection for Europe while they were redeveloping in a capitalist economy and to deter the Soviet Union from interfering in that. But once the Cold War ended, true to the self-interests of the states that were driving NATO, those shifted. In Bosnia, particularly with the motivation of Great Britain to get involved in that, this is where the first use of force for NATO to intervene in the Bosnian War, and then the United States actually played the mediator role to end that war, but we did not get involved in that for 3 years until the superpowers were motivated to get in there and stop it, and then so therefore NATO then started to redefine its mission. Afghanistan war, NATO eventually took over the administration of that war after the United States initiated, and the United States even added 30,000 troops in 2010 to assist the NATO forces in order to try to bring that one to at least to some sort of conclusion, even though we are technically still in Afghanistan. NATO also got involved in Libya to assist the overthrow of Gaddafi. Funding of NATO is voluntary. The goal is 2% of GDP on defense. And this has also been a Trump administration talking point, to where, with particularly France and Germany being below that 2% level, so that resulted in some rhetoric there in the election and during the Trump administration, trying to pressure France and Germany to upping their percentage, or even threatening the United States to pull out of it or take some of their percent out. U.S. does account, because of over the years, the United States has been the driving force behind this. They were the driving force behind its existence, its creation in the first place. And the United States had taken on that role, and then has its own interests in trying to promote peace and democracy throughout the world. They provide 22% of the budget. Here is the general common funded budget there. This is not, it does not include extraneous activities such as getting involved in the Afghanistan war and things like that. But as far as the common budget, the United States is 22%. Even though France and Germany may not necessarily be providing a certain amount of defense spending to their GDP, they do provide a major bulk of the expense to NATO. Germany, there you can see, is at 14%, France at almost 11% of the funding there. More on alliances. The United States-Japanese Security Treaty. The U.S. maintains 35,000 troops there in order to, particularly since the end of World War II, where a lot of restrictions were put on Japan, and our presence was very strong there to maintain that. It is a bilateral agreement, which means it's an agreement just between the United States and Japan, and according to the realist view, the United States typically prefers bilateral agreements because they can therefore control the shots, kind of as a hub of a bicycle wheel. And this is Japan's only major alliance, and that also provides a little bit of consternation from China. South Korea, another very strong ally, 25,000 troops, mainly there because of the potential threat for North Korea. And obviously we were involved with South Korea very early on in the aftermath of World War II to stop the spread of communism. So we'll get into more on that later. Now, the Commonwealth of Independent States was the former Soviet Union alliance, to where Soviet republics are still aligned in this, but there's no joint military force in that group. They mainly aligned just to for common interests under the Soviet sphere. And even with Putin as increasing his authoritarian rule in Russia, it's fairly obvious that he would like to bring those former Soviet republics back into the fold and perhaps increase his power or influence somewhat in the world. Statecraft is more of a realist term for maximizing your international influence. So if powerful states such as United States, Russia, and China want to maximize their influence, they'll engage in various tactics of statecraft. One example is of China that is refusing to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Taiwan has long lobbied the United States and the United Nations for their own independence, while China refuses to recognize that, and then therefore puts pressure on states that are trying to recognize Taiwan as an independent state. So that matters, because China, much bigger, powerful economy, you don't want to make them mad. That could hurt you in some ways. So we kind of toe the line there and deal with Taiwan virtually as an independent state, but don't necessarily acknowledge that they are an independent state. Deterrence is the concept to where some form of military buildup, or nuclear arms, as we'll talk about later, in order to prevent conflict. So what this is doing is telling other people that I have a very strong military, so you do not want to invade me and you do not want to attack me, because then it would be worse on you. That was the philosophy behind the arms race. And that if I have more nuclear weapons than you won't attack me, because if you do, I would still have enough to wipe you off the face of the earth. Obviously, this reciprocal process led to this mutual escalation of the arms race and extraordinary costs to do that. And then it got to where it was almost ridiculous, and to the point where each side had way more enough nuclear arms to destroy the world many times over. And then as we get in the 60s, where we had some close calls, it started to turn around. And now, since the late 60s, we have a very strong global norm that we do not want any more nuclear weapons. And since that time, we have gradually been eliminating nuclear weapons from the arsenals. And that's still a very contentious, touchy issue. There's lots of states that still feel like, if they had nuclear weapons, then they'd feel more secure, that other states would not bother them or invade them. So that is still a very serious issue in the world, despite the fact that a growing international norm has been pretty strong in saying that we want to eliminate nuclear weapons and prevent the manufacture of any more nuclear weapons. Now, this concept of rational choice, I'm going to talk about more in another lecture. Rational choice, particularly from an economic perspective, it means that you make your decisions based on your own self-interest, and you're trying to maximize your own utility of some sort. I want to maximize my income. I want to maximize my education. I want to maximize my number of friends, my popularity, what it is. So those are where I have the ability to calculate what I can do to maximize that particular self-interest. So from the realist view, states are the rational actors that are trying to identify their own national interests, set their priorities, and perhaps even maximize their benefits in that way. So therefore, we've got lots of questions. Does this promote cooperation or conflict? So that's the kind of the common theme that we'll be talking about, is that we tend to agree that conflict is expensive and counterproductive, but yet pursuing our own self-interest continues to present the possibility of conflict, whereas cooperation takes considerable more effort and political will to do that, and perhaps even a little bit of sacrificing some of your own national interest to do that. So then we're looking at costs versus benefits of whatever decisions we make in the international system. And then the prisoner's dilemma is an interesting game theory concept, to where if we are pursuing our own self-interest and using rational choice to maximize what we want, and this is perhaps using a zero-sum assumption, which means whatever I win, you lose, and vice versa, and that obviously contributes to more competition out there. But because of this pursuit of our own rational choice based on our self-interest, actors might choose outcomes that are less than optimal than if they'd been able to cooperate and communicate, and then been able to come up with benefits that would be better than that. Now, before I get too much further into the prisoner's dilemma, what I would like to do, I may do this on the discussion forum, is play a little kind of prisoner's dilemma game for the discussion forum. So this is the conclusion of Chapter 2, Realist Perspective, and then in Chapter 3, we will look at the institutionalist perspective, as well as some other social theories of the international system.